The rich man ties his deaf son to a post and gets in the car. Lightning splits the sky. The child screams in silence. Through the storm, a white horse appears and stares at the boy. But before we continue, if you love animals as much as we do, subscribe to the channel so you never miss a heartfelt story. Thank you. Now, back to our story. The storm approached in silence, a whispered warning carried by darkening clouds that gradually consumed the vast Montana sky. On the sprawling Mitchell Ranch, where everything was measured and controlled with military precision, 12-year-old Ethan Mitchell stood bound to an old wooden post in the center of the east pasture. His clothes already clung to his small frame, dampened by the first scattered raindrops that fell like cold judgments from above. Ethan couldn't hear the distant rumble of thunder, nor the anxious whispers of the ranch hands who watched from the safety of the barn. Born deaf, he experienced the world through vibrations, expressions, and a heightened visual awareness that made him exceptional at reading both people and animals. But his father, Robert Mitchell, saw only what was missing. To Robert, his son's deafness was a defect to be corrected, a weakness to be eliminated through discipline and harsh lessons. Today's punishment had come because Ethan had wandered to the creek beyond the property line, following a wounded fox he'd spotted limping through the tall grass. He hadn't heard his father's whistled signal for lunch, hadn't felt the vibration of the ranch bell that sometimes reached him through the ground. By the time he'd returned, mud-spattered and concerned about the animal he couldn't find, Robert's face had already hardened into the mask Ethan knew too well. "You'll learn to pay attention," Robert had signed with sharp, angular movements before dragging his son to the post. His father knew enough sign language to issue commands and express disappointment, but little else. As Robert secured the rope around his wrists, looping it through a metal ring embedded in the weathered wood, Ethan kept his eyes down, knowing any sign of defiance would only make things worse. From the corner of the barn, Miguel Ramirez watched, his stomach clenching. 6 months ago, he'd been the ranch's head wrangler until he'd confronted Robert about his treatment of the boy. That confrontation had cost him his job, but not his concern for Ethan. He'd stayed in the area, finding work at the neighboring Carson property, unable to completely leave, knowing what the boy endured. "That man's going to break that child," Miguel muttered to himself, crouching behind a stand of cottonwoods that marked the property line. Or maybe that child will break him. Either way, he wouldn't leave Ethan alone in the gathering storm. Inside the main stable, a 7-year-old American quarter horse named Thunder paced restlessly in his stall. With a glossy black coat and a single white blaze running down his face, Thunder was the most spirited animal on the property. Too spirited for Robert's taste, but a perfect match for Ethan's gentle patience. Their connection had formed 3 summers ago, when Thunder was still a half-wild colt that the wranglers struggled to break. The horse had thrown every rider who'd attempted to mount him, earning a reputation for being unmanageable. Robert had been ready to sell him off when he discovered Ethan in the paddock one morning, sitting quietly in the dirt while Thunder stood nearby, watching with curious eyes. Something about the boy's stillness had intrigued the horse. Over the following weeks, Ethan had spent every spare moment with Thunder, never pushing, just existing in the same space. Miguel had been the first to notice their strange bond, how Thunder would position himself between Ethan and anyone who approached too quickly, how the horse seemed to understand that sound couldn't reach the boy. Thunder had become Ethan's translator in a way, alerting him to approaching people with a nudge or shifting his weight when someone called from behind. The horse watched Ethan's hands when he signed, focused with an intensity that made even skeptical ranch hands wonder if the animal somehow understood. Now, as lightning split the sky to the west, Thunder's ears flicked forward. He moved to the half-door of his stall, extending his neck to see through the barn window. His nostrils flared at the scent of rain and ozone and something else. Fear. Though separated by hundreds of yards, the horse sensed Ethan's distress, like it was his own. In the house, Robert Mitchell poured himself 3 fingers of whiskey and stared out the kitchen window at the distant figure of his son. Something uncomfortable twisted in his chest. Not quite regret, not exactly doubt, but a nagging dissonance he preferred to drown rather than examine. His late wife, Sarah, would have understood their son in ways Robert couldn't. She'd been the one to insist on sign language classes, to research deaf education, to fill their home with visual communication tools. But 3 years after her death in a car accident, those tools gathered dust in a closet Robert kept locked. "He needs to learn," Robert muttered to his empty kitchen. "World won't coddle him like she did." The words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Outside, the first heavy raindrops began to fall, striking the tin roof of the house with increasing urgency. Robert refilled his glass, trying to ignore the darkening sky and the voice in his head that sounded suspiciously like Sarah's. In the pasture, Ethan lifted his face to the rain. Without sound, storms were a purely sensory experience. The smell of wet earth rising around him, the feel of water running down his face, the vibration of thunder he could sometimes feel through the ground. He wasn't afraid of the weather. Montana storms were common enough, but the isolation of the punishment made his heart race. He knew from the darkness of the clouds that this wasn't an ordinary summer shower. The temperature dropped suddenly as wind whipped across the open pasture. Ethan shivered, his light flannel shirt providing little protection. He tried to make himself smaller, hunching his shoulders against the gust that bent the tall grasses around him. Through the curtain of rain, he could just make out the warm glow of windows from the main house, less than a quarter mile away, but impossibly distant. Thunder's agitation grew with each passing minute. He pawed at the ground, tossing his head, and snorting as the other horses in the stable grew equally restless. Jackson, the young stable hand left to watch the horses, tried to calm them. "Easy, boy. Just a storm. Nothing to get worked up over." But Thunder wasn't responding to the storm. He was responding to something only he seemed aware of. When a particularly bright flash of lightning illuminated the stable, followed immediately by a tremendous crack that shook the building, the horse reared up suddenly, nearly striking his head on the wooden beams above. Before Jackson could react, Thunder kicked powerfully at his stall door. The wood splintered but held. "Christ!" Jackson scrambled backward. "Mr. Mitchell's gonna have my hide if you hurt yourself." He reached for a lead rope hanging nearby, intending to secure the animal more thoroughly, but Thunder's eyes were wild now, focused on something beyond the walls. Miles away in the small town of Clearwater, Mrs. Eleanor Davis sat at her kitchen table with a cup of herbal tea, watching the storm through windows framed by lace curtains. At 72, the former elementary school teacher had devoted most of her life to the children of this community. Though retired now, her home remained a sanctuary for troubled youth, a place where cookies were always fresh and judgment was never served. Eleanor had known Sarah Mitchell since she was a girl in Eleanor's third-grade class. She'd watched her grow into a compassionate woman, had celebrated at her wedding to Robert, and had mourned deeply at her funeral. In the years since, she'd tried to maintain a connection with young Ethan, but Robert had gradually closed ranks, isolating himself and his son on the ranch that had been in the Mitchell family for 4 generations. "That storm's setting in right over their land," she murmured, rising to peer more closely through the glass. Something about the darkening sky made her uneasy, a feeling she couldn't quite name, but had learned never to ignore. She reached for the phone, hesitated, then set it down again. Robert wouldn't appreciate her concern, would see it as interference, rather than the neighborly gesture she intended. Instead, she said a quick prayer for both father and son, unaware that her intuition was more accurate than she knew. Back at the ranch, Miguel had made a decision. Pulling his weathered cowboy hat lower against the driving rain, He slipped through the fence and made his way toward the barn. If he could get to Ethan, get him untied and somewhere dry, he'd deal with Robert's anger afterward. But as he moved, through the pelting rain, a sound caught his attention, the distinctive crack of wood giving way under force. Miguel turned toward the stable just in time to see thunder burst through his stall door, sending splinters flying. The powerful horse shouldered past the startled Jackson and charged into the storm, his black coat immediately slick with rain, his path unerring despite the sheets of water now falling from the sky. "Jesus," Miguel breathed, watching as the horse galloped directly toward the isolated figure in the pasture. "He's going for the boy!" Thunder raced across the pasture, each powerful stride eating up the distance between the stable and the solitary figure tied to the post. Rain pelted, his muscular body running in rivulets down his midnight coat, but his focus never wavered. The horse moved with singular purpose, as if drawn by an invisible thread that connected him to the boy. In the driving rain, Ethan spotted the dark shape moving toward him. Even through the curtain of water, he recognized Thunder's distinctive gait, the way the horse held his head high despite the storm. A flutter of relief replaced the cold fear in his chest. He wasn't alone anymore. Thunder slowed as he approached, circling the post once before coming to stand directly in front of Ethan. The horse's large body created a partial windbreak, shielding the boy from the worst of the gusting rain. Steam rose from Thunder's rain-soaked back as he lowered his head to nuzzle Ethan's shoulder, his breath warm against the boy's cold skin. Ethan leaned his forehead against Thunder's neck, drawing comfort from the solid presence. The horse's heart beat strong and steady against him, a rhythm he could feel through his entire body. With his hands bound, he couldn't sign, couldn't express his gratitude, but Thunder seemed to understand anyway, remaining perfectly still for several moments before suddenly raising his head, ears pricked forward in alert. From his vantage point near the fence line, Miguel watched in amazement as Thunder began to tug at the ropes binding Ethan with his teeth. The horse worked with careful precision, pulling and releasing, trying different angles. It wasn't random. There was clear intent behind the animal's actions. "Dios mío," Miguel whispered, crossing himself despite not having been to church in years. He'd heard stories of horses performing remarkable feats of intelligence, but had always dismissed them as exaggerations. Now, witnessing Thunder's deliberate attempt to free Ethan, he found himself re-evaluating everything he thought he knew about animal consciousness. Inside the main house, Robert Mitchell drained his second glass of whiskey, the alcohol doing little to quiet the persistent voice of his conscience. The storm had intensified far beyond what the weather service had predicted. Wind now howled around the eaves of the house, and rain lashed against the windows with growing violence. Lightning flashed with increasing frequency, followed by thunder that rattled the dishes in the cupboards. Robert moved to the window again, squinting through the downpour. The solitary figure of his son was barely visible now, a small, dark shape hunched against the wooden post. Something larger moved nearby. Horse, he realized with a surge of alarm. Thunder must have gotten loose. Cursing, Robert grabbed his oilskin coat and hat from hooks by the door. He snatched a coiled whip from the wall as an afterthought. Thunder could be unpredictable, especially around strangers. But around Ethan... Robert hesitated at the door, his hand on the knob. The boy had a way with the animal that both impressed and unsettled him. It was as if they communicated without words, without sound, a connection Robert couldn't understand, and therefore didn't trust. The horse responded to Ethan in ways it responded to no one else, not even Miguel, who'd had a gift with difficult animals. Another flash of lightning decided him. Robert yanked the door open and plunged into the storm, driven as much by concern for his son as by the need to regain control over a situation rapidly spinning beyond his reach. Thunder continued his attempts to free Ethan, tugging at the ropes. with increasing urgency as the storm intensified. The horse seemed to understand the growing danger, working methodically despite the chaos of the elements around them. When teeth alone proved insufficient, Thunder changed tactics. He moved his large body alongside the post and began to push against it with his shoulder, applying steady pressure that made the weathered wood creak. Ethan felt the post shift slightly in the softening ground. Hope flared briefly, then faded. As the old wood held firm, the post had been set deep, designed to secure much larger animals than a 12-year-old boy. Still, Thunder's presence gave him courage. He twisted his wrists within the ropes, searching for any give, any weakness in his father's knots. The sudden flash of a powerful flashlight beam cut through the rain, catching horse and boy in its stark illumination. Robert approached, his tall figure distorted by the oilskin coat that whipped around his legs in the wind. His face was a mask of anger and something else, fear, though Ethan didn't recognize it as such. "Get away from him!" Robert shouted uselessly, forgetting in his agitation that his son couldn't hear him. He raised the whip, cracking it near Thunder's flank in a warning meant to drive the horse back. Thunder didn't flinch. Instead, the horse pivoted smoothly, positioning himself between Ethan and his approaching father. His ears flattened against his head, his posture now defensive rather than nurturing. A tremor ran through his powerful muscles, but he stood his ground. Dark, eyes fixed on Robert with an intensity that stopped the man several yards away. Robert had worked with horses his entire life. He understood their behaviors, their cues, their warnings. What he saw now chilled him more than the driving rain. Thunder was protecting Ethan from him. The realization struck him like a physical blow. His own horse saw him as a threat to his son. "Easy," Robert said, lowering the whip slightly. "Easy now." His voice carried none of his usual authority, shaken as he was by the tableau before him. Thunder pawed at the ground once, a clear warning. The horse's message couldn't have been more explicit if he'd spoken aloud, "Come no closer." For a moment, the three figures remained frozen in their strange standoff. The father with his whip half raised, the horse standing guard, the boy watching, with wide eyes from behind his unlikely protector. Only the storm moved around them, indifferent to the human drama playing out beneath its fury. Miles away, Miguel Ramirez burst through the door of the Clearwater Diner, water streaming from his clothes onto the worn linoleum floor. The handful of locals seeking refuge from the storm looked up in surprise as the former ranch hand scanned the room with desperate eyes. "Sheriff Porter," Miguel gasped, spotting the county sheriff nursing a cup of coffee at the counter. "It's the Mitchell boy. His father's got him tied up out in this storm." A murmur ran through the diner as Sheriff Jim Porter set down his cup. "Say that again, son." "Ethan Mitchell," Miguel said, moving closer. "Robert's got him tied to a post in the east pasture. Been there over an hour now in this weather." Porter's weathered face hardened. "That's a serious accusation, Ramirez. You and Robert had your differences when he let you go." "This isn't about that," Miguel cut in. "I saw it with my own eyes. The boy's out there right now, and that storm's getting worse by the minute." Eleanor Davis, who had stopped at the diner for soup before heading home, approached slowly, her face pale. "Miguel, are you certain? Robert's always been strict, but this..." "Mrs. Davis, I wouldn't make this up. Not about Ethan." Miguel held her gaze, letting her see the truth in his eyes. "The horse, Thunder. He broke out of the stable, went straight to the boy. Like he knew, he's trying to protect him, but Robert's out there now with a whip." Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth. "Sarah's boy," she whispered. Then, with sudden resolve, she turned to the sheriff. "Jim, we're going out there, now." Porter hesitated, torn between his official duties and his personal reluctance to interfere in family matters. "Eleanor, discipline's a parent's right." "No," Eleanor said. her voice carrying the authority of 4 decades in a classroom. No form of discipline includes endangering a child in a lightning storm. Either you come with your badge, Jim Porter, or I'll go myself with whoever in this room. Still remembers what's right. The diner had fallen completely silent. Then Mac Jensen, who owned the hardware store, stood up. "My truck's outside. Got room for 4. 5 in mine," added Diane Whitaker, the postal carrier. One by one, others stood until nearly everyone in the diner had volunteered. Porter looked around at his neighbors and sighed. "All right. But we do this proper. No vigilante nonsense." Back at the ranch, the standoff continued. Robert had taken one step forward, testing Thunder's resolve, and the horse had responded by shifting position, blocking his view of Ethan almost entirely. Lightning split the sky directly overhead, followed immediately by a deafening crash of thunder that Robert felt in his bones. In that brilliant flash, he saw his son's face clearly for the first time since approaching, the mixture of fear and resignation in Ethan's eyes. The way the boy seemed to expect nothing but further punishment. It was a look that belonged to a much older face, one that had learned to anticipate cruelty rather than kindness. Something broke inside Robert Mitchell in that moment. Some dam of grief and rage and stubborn pride that had been holding back the flood of his own pain since Sarah's death. He dropped the whip, letting it fall forgotten into the mud at his feet. "Ethan," he said, then caught himself, raising his hands to sign instead. His movements were rusty, unpracticed, but he formed the words with care. "I'm sorry." Ethan stared at his father, disbelief plain on his face. In all the years since his mother's passing, he had never seen those words from his father's hands. Before either could move, headlights cut through the rain behind them. Vehicles were approaching along the ranch road, far more than would be expected on a night like this. Robert turned, squinting against the sudden brightness to see a procession of trucks and cars pulling to a stop at the edge of the pasture. Car doors opened, and figures emerged. Into the storm, Sheriff Porter, Eleanor Davis, Miguel, and what looked like half the town of Clearwater. They moved towards the strange tableau in the field, faces grim and determined, flashlight beams bouncing through the rain. "Mitchell," Porter called out over the howl of the wind. "Step away from the boy." Eleanor didn't wait for the sheriff. She moved past him with surprising speed for a woman her age, making straight for Ethan. Thunder watched her approach but didn't interfere, seeming to recognize she posed no threat. She reached the boy and gasped at the sight of the ropes cutting into his wrists. "Oh, Ethan," she said, though she knew he couldn't hear her. With fingers made clumsy by age and cold, she began to work at the knots. Miguel appeared at her side. A moment later, pulling a pocket knife from his jeans to slice through the stubborn ropes. As Ethan's hands came free, Eleanor pulled a blanket from under her raincoat, she had come prepared, and wrapped it around his shoulders. The boy's fingers were blue with cold, but they moved in a flurry of signs that Eleanor struggled to follow, her sign language rusty from disuse. Miguel, however, understood perfectly. He had continued practicing ASL after leaving the ranch, unwilling to lose his connection to Ethan. "He says Thunder came to help him," Miguel translated for Eleanor. "He says the horse knew he was in trouble." Eleanor nodded, unsurprised. "Animals often understand more than we give them credit for." She looked over at Robert, who stood now with Sheriff Porter's hand on his shoulder, watching as the neighbors he'd kept at arm's length for years came to his son's aid. "Let's get you somewhere warm," Eleanor signed to Ethan, her movements slow but clear. The boy nodded, then turned to Thunder, resting his forehead briefly against the horse's muzzle in a gesture of silent gratitude. The animal stood perfectly, still, allowing the moment of connection before gently nudging Ethan toward Eleanor's waiting arms. As they moved toward the vehicles, cell phones emerged from pockets and purses. In the harsh glow of flashlights and headlights, photos and videos captured the image of a boy, a horse, and a community united against both storm and cruelty. By morning, those images would spread far beyond the boundaries of Clearwater, beginning a chain reaction that none of them could yet imagine. Eleanor Davis's cottage sat at the end of Maple Street, its weathered blue clapboards and white trim a familiar landmark in Clearwater. The morning after the storm, weak sunlight filtered through lace curtains into the guest bedroom, where Ethan Mitchell slept beneath a patchwork quilt that Eleanor's grandmother had stitched nearly a century ago. The boy's face in repose looked younger than his 12 years, the worry lines that habitually creased his forehead temporarily smoothed by exhaustion and the safety of his surroundings. Eleanor moved quietly around the kitchen below, preparing a breakfast that would tempt a child who'd barely touched the soup she'd warmed for him the night before. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, beating eggs and slicing fresh strawberries, while her mind worked through the events of the previous evening and the challenging days that would surely follow. Sheriff Porter had taken Robert to the station, not in handcuffs, but with a firm suggestion that they needed to have a conversation. Child Protective Services had been notified, though the weekend meant no official action would happen until Monday. For now, with Robert's reluctant agreement and a temporary emergency placement order, Ethan would stay with Eleanor. 3 days, she murmured, sliding bread into the toaster. 3 days to show that boy what family should feel like. A soft noise from the doorway made her turn. Ethan stood there in borrowed pajamas that hung loose on his thin frame, his dark hair tousled from sleep. He watched her with cautious eyes, his hands fidgeting slightly at his sides as if unsure whether to speak. Eleanor smiled warmly and signed, "Good morning. Hungry?" Her movements were deliberate but fluid, the result of lessons she'd taken years ago when Sarah first learned of Ethan's deafness. Ethan nodded hesitantly, then his hands moved in a question. Thunder. Eleanor's heart squeezed at his first concern being for the horse rather than himself. "Safe at the ranch," she signed. "Miguel is caring for him." Relief visibly washed over the boy's face. He moved to the kitchen table, perching on the edge of a chair, as if prepared to flee at any moment. Eleanor set a glass of orange juice before him, then returned to the stove, giving him space while keeping him in her peripheral vision. In truth, she had not told Ethan everything. After bringing the boy to her home, Miguel and several other men had returned to the Mitchell Ranch to check on the animals, only to discover Thunder missing from the stable, where they'd secured him. A search of the property had yielded nothing. The horse had vanished into the night. Across town, in the stark confines of the sheriff's office, Robert Mitchell sat with his head in his hands. He hadn't been charged, not yet, but the implied threat hung in the air between him and Sheriff Porter, who watched him from behind a desk cluttered with the detritus of 30 years in law enforcement. "I don't understand what you want from me, Jim," Robert finally said, his voice hoarse from a night of minimal sleep and maximum regret. Porter leaned back in his chair, the ancient springs protesting. "I want you to tell me what the hell you were thinking, Bob. That's your boy, your flesh and blood, Sarah's son." At the mention of his late wife, Robert flinched. "Don't bring her into this. She's already in it. Has been since the day she died." Porter's tone was matter-of-fact rather than accusatory. "You think folks around here haven't noticed how you changed? How that boy changed? Sarah wouldn't recognize either one of you now." Robert's hands clenched into fists on his knees. "You don't know anything about it. Then tell me." Porter pushed a styrofoam cup of coffee across the desk. "Make me understand how a man I've known for 30 years ends up tying his deaf son to a post in a thunderstorm." For a long moment, the only sound in the office was the tick of the wall clock and the distant ringing of a phone at the dispatcher's desk. Then Robert reached for the coffee, his hands trembling slightly. "I couldn't reach him," he said finally, staring into the dark liquid. After Sarah, it was like he'd disappeared inside himself. All those signs, all that hand-waving she taught him. "I never." You never bothered to learn it proper, Porter finished for him. So instead of finding a way to talk to your son, you decided fear would work better. Robert had no answer for that. The truth of it scraped against the raw places inside him, places he'd been numbing with work and whiskey for 3 long years. What happens now? He asked after another silence. Porter sighed. That depends on a lot of things. CPS will be involved. There'll be an investigation. But mostly, it depends on you, Bob, on what you're willing to do to fix what's broken between you and that boy. Back at Eleanor's cottage, Ethan had surprised himself by cleaning his plate. The eggs, toast, and fruit had awakened an appetite he hadn't realized he possessed. Now he sat in Eleanor's sunroom, a sketch pad open on his lap and colored pencils scattered on the wicker table beside him. Eleanor had produced the art supplies without explanation, simply placing them near him before moving to tend her collection of houseplants. She didn't hover or demand to see what he was drawing, a courtesy that Ethan found both unusual and deeply appreciated. His hand moved across the paper, capturing Thunder's sleek form from memory. He drew the horse as he had seen him in the storm, proud, defiant, protective. The pencil lines seemed to vibrate with the same energy he had felt from Thunder in those moments when the animal had positioned himself between Ethan and his father. Eleanor watched discreetly as the image took shape. The technical skill surprised her. No one had mentioned Ethan's artistic ability, but even more striking was the emotion evident in every line. The boy wasn't just reproducing what he had seen. He was expressing what he had felt. Outside, a flicker of movement caught her attention. Eleanor moved to the window, adjusting her glasses to peer into the backyard that extended toward a small wooded area at the edge of town. There, half hidden among the trees, stood a large black shape with a distinctive white blaze. "Ethan!" she signed, her movements quick with excitement. "Come look!" The boy set aside his drawing and joined her at the window. His whole body tensed, then relaxed in recognition. Without hesitation, he moved to the back door, flinging it open and rushing into the yard. Thunder emerged from the trees, moving with the same purposeful stride that had carried him across the storm-lashed pasture. The horse had traveled over 10 miles through unfamiliar territory, somehow finding his way to the exact location where Ethan had been taken. Eleanor remained in the doorway, watching in astonishment as Ethan ran to meet the horse. Thunder lowered his head, allowing the boy to throw his arms around his neck in an embrace that spoke volumes without a single word. Ethan's shoulders shook with silent sobs, his face buried in the horse's mane. The moment was so intensely private that Eleanor stepped back slightly, feeling like an intruder. Yet she couldn't look away from the profound connection unfolding in her backyard, a connection that transcended language, species, and the ordinary boundaries of understanding. By mid-afternoon, news of Thunder's remarkable journey had spread throughout Clearwater. Neighbors drove slowly past Eleanor's house, hoping to glimpse the hero horse that social media had already made famous well beyond the boundaries of their small town. Videos taken the previous night had gone viral, prompting calls from news outlets as far away as Seattle and Denver. Miguel arrived shortly after lunch, having followed reports of Thunder's appearance to Eleanor's home. His relief at finding the horse unharmed was palpable. 10 miles, he kept saying, shaking his head in wonder, through forest and fields, across the highway. He shouldn't have been able to find this place. Eleanor watched as Miguel checked Thunder over, running experienced hands along the horse's legs and examining him for injuries. "Animals often know things we don't," she said. "Sarah used to say that about Ethan too, that he noticed things others missed." Miguel nodded, remembering how the boy could read the subtle cues of animals in distress, how he seemed to anticipate their needs before they showed obvious signs. "They're alike that way," he said, watching as Ethan approached with a bucket of water for Thunder. "They listen with more than ears." The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Diane Whitaker pulled up in her mail truck, But instead of simply delivering letters, she approached Eleanor with a large envelope. "Special delivery," she said, "from the school district." Inside was a letter from the superintendent and several information packets about a specialized program for deaf students at the regional school, just a 30-minute drive from Clearwater. The program had been established years ago, but according to the letter, there had been communication issues with Robert that had prevented Ethan's enrollment. "They've had a spot for him all this time," Eleanor said, scanning the documents with growing indignation. All this time, he could have been learning, connecting with other deaf children. Diane nodded grimly. "Superintendent Phillips has been trying to reach Robert for nearly 2 years. After what happened yesterday, she thought you might need this information." As Eleanor read through the materials, an idea began to form, not just for Ethan's immediate future, but for something larger, something that might benefit the entire community. She thanked Diane and hurried to find her address book, suddenly eager to make several calls. Inside the house, Ethan had returned to his drawings. Having captured Thunder in various poses, he had now begun drawing the events of the previous night. His pencil moved with increasing confidence as he depicted the storm, his father with the whip, Thunder's protective stance, and finally, the arrival of the townspeople with their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Each image told part of the story, but together they created a narrative more powerful than words could express. Emotion infused every line, fear, courage, hope, connection, rendered with an insight that belied the artist's youth. When Eleanor returned and saw what Ethan had created, she sat beside him, pointing to the drawings with genuine admiration. "These are remarkable," she signed. "May I show them to someone who might help us share them?" Ethan hesitated, then nodded slowly. He pulled the final drawing toward him, adding a few more details before handing it to Eleanor. This one showed Thunder standing in her backyard, his journey complete, with Ethan's arms around his neck. In the background, barely visible but unmistakable, was the figure of a woman with flowing hair, watching over them from the edge of the woods. A figure that looked remarkably like Sarah. Mitchell. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. She didn't comment on this addition, simply including it with the others as she carefully placed the drawings in a folder. By evening, Thunder had been provided with temporary accommodations in a small shed in Eleanor's backyard, modified by Miguel and several volunteers who arrived with hay, water troughs, and other necessities. The horse seemed content with the arrangement, especially with Ethan's constant attention. The boy's transformation over a single day was remarkable. Although still quiet and watchful, the hunched shoulders and defensive posture had begun to ease. He moved with more confidence in Eleanor's home, accepting her presence without the wariness that had initially marked his every glance. After dinner, as Ethan sat on the back porch, watching Thunder graze in the lengthening shadows, Eleanor received a phone call that she took in the kitchen, her voice low but animated. When she returned to the porch, her eyes were bright with purpose. "Ethan," she signed, sitting beside him, "I've spoken with some people who think your drawings are very special. They want to show them to others, to help people understand your story and Thunder's." The boy's expression was cautious but curious. "There's an event next month at the community center," Eleanor continued, her signs deliberate. "An art show with work from students all around the county. They would like to include your drawings if you're willing, and Thunder could be there too." She didn't mention that the call had been with Superintendent Phillips, or that the event had been hastily reconfigured from a simple student showcase to a fundraiser for the deaf education program. Those details could wait. Ethan considered for a long moment, his gaze returning to Thunder, then his hands moved. "Will my father be there?" The question caught Eleanor off guard. She had expected hesitation, perhaps fear, but not this direct query that suggested Ethan was already thinking of reconciliation despite everything that had happened. "That would be your choice," she signed carefully. "No one will make you see him if you don't want to." Ethan nodded, processing this information. Then, to Eleanor's surprise, he signed, "I want him to see what I can do." There was no bitterness in the statement, no desire for revenge or validation, simply a child's natural wish to be seen, truly seen by his parent. The simplicity of it broke Eleanor's heart and reforged it stronger in the same moment. "Then that's what we'll work toward," she promised. Later that night, after Ethan had gone to bed, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea and the folder of drawings. She studied each one, marveling at the boy's ability to capture not just images, but emotions on paper. In the quiet of her small house, with the occasional soft nickering of thunder from the backyard, she allowed herself to hope that something transformative had begun, not just for Ethan, but for an entire community that had perhaps been deaf, in its own way, to the needs of its most vulnerable members. As she put the drawings away, her gaze lingered on the final image, with its suggestion of Sarah watching over her son. Whether the figure represented memory, hope, or something more transcendent was impossible to know. But its presence in Ethan's art spoke to a connection that even death had not severed, a love that continued to shape his world in ways both seen and unseen, just as Thunder's silent devotion had crossed miles of unknown territory to find him. The Clearwater Community Center had never seen such a crowd. On the evening of the art exhibition, cars lined both sides of Main Street for 3 blocks, and visitors from neighboring towns mingled with locals inside the brightly lit space. What had begun as a modest student showcase had transformed into something much larger, fueled by social media attention and the compelling story behind the featured artwork. Eleanor stood near the entrance, greeting familiar faces and directing newcomers toward the refreshment table staffed by volunteers. From the Ladies' Auxiliary, she wore her best dress for the occasion, a deep blue ensemble that Sarah Mitchell had once complimented, and a small butterfly pin that Ethan had given her that morning, a thank you gift he'd made with materials from the craft store. "Quite a turnout," Sheriff Porter commented, appearing at her side with a paper cup of punch. "Philip says they've already raised enough to fund the deaf education program for 2 years. Eleanor nodded, pleased but distracted. Her eyes kept returning to the door. "Have you seen Robert?" Porter's expression sobered. "Not yet, but he said he'd come." Over the past month, Robert Mitchell had been a man transformed, or perhaps more accurately, a man returning to himself after a long absence. The legal consequences of his actions that stormy night had been tempered by his genuine remorse and his commitment to making amends. The court had mandated parenting classes, counseling, and community service, but Robert had gone further, enrolling in intensive sign language courses and beginning the process of renovating his home to accommodate Ethan's eventual return. "He'll be here," Eleanor said with more confidence than she felt. "He needs to be." At the center of the exhibition, in a space specifically designed for maximum visibility, Ethan's drawings hung in simple black frames. They had been arranged chronologically, telling the story of that fateful night and its aftermath with raw, emotional power. Enlarged and professionally mounted, the images had lost none of their impact in the transition from sketchbook to gallery wall. Visitors moved slowly along the display, their conversations dropping to whispers as they absorbed the narrative. Some wiped away tears. Others stood in prolonged silence before particular images. The drawing of Thunder standing guard between father and son seemed to affect viewers most deeply, capturing as it did a moment of profound choice. An animal, acting with what could only be described as moral courage. In a courtyard behind the community center, Ethan sat on a wooden bench beside Thunder, who had been brought in for the event with special permission and considerable coordination. The horse stood calmly despite the unusual surroundings, occasionally lowering his head to nudge the boy's shoulder affectionately. Miguel approached, carrying a bottle of water and a program from the exhibition. "Almost time," he signed, having significantly improved his ASL skills over the past weeks. "Nervous?" Ethan shook his head, then reconsidered and nodded slightly. His hands moved. "What if he doesn't come?" Miguel crouched to meet the boy's eyes directly. "He'll come," he signed with confidence. "But even if something happens and he can't, remember that tonight is about you and Thunder, about your story, your art." Ethan nodded again, more decisively this time. He stroked Thunder's neck, drawing strength from the horse's steady presence. The animal had become a fixture at Eleanor's house, adapting remarkably well to suburban life. Neighbors who had initially expressed concern about having a horse in their midst now stopped by regularly with apples and carrots, enchanted by the story that had captured hearts far beyond Clearwater. Inside, Superintendent Phillips approached the small podium, set up at one end of the exhibition space. The crowd quieted as she welcomed everyone and explained the purpose of the event. Not just to showcase student artwork, but to raise awareness and funds for educational programs serving deaf and hard-of-hearing children in the county. Tonight's featured artist has taught us all something profound about communication that transcends words, she said, her voice carrying across the hushed room. His work reminds us that sometimes the most important messages are conveyed not through what we hear with our ears, but what we understand with our hearts. As she spoke, a slight commotion at the entrance drew Eleanor's attention. Robert Mitchell stood in the doorway, his tall frame awkward in a suit that looked recently purchased and slightly too large. His hair was neatly combed, his face clean-shaven, but what struck Eleanor most was his expression, a mixture of determination and barely contained emotion. Their eyes met across the crowded room. Eleanor excused herself from her conversation with Porter and made her way toward Robert, threading between clusters of visitors until she reached him. "You came," she said simply. Robert nodded, his hands fidgeting with the brim of the hat he held. "How is he?" "Waiting for you," Eleanor replied. She didn't need to elaborate. They both understood the weight of those words. "Come with me." As they moved toward the courtyard, Robert paused before the wall of Ethan's artwork. His steps slowed, then stopped entirely as he took in the images that depicted his worst moment as a father with unflinching honesty. The shame that washed over his face was painful to witness, but Eleanor didn't look away or offer false comfort. This reckoning was necessary, a threshold that couldn't be avoided if healing was to begin. "I didn't see," Robert said softly, his gaze fixed on the drawing of Thunder standing between him and his son. "All this time, I didn't see what was right in front of me." "But you're seeing now," Eleanor replied. "That's what matters to Ethan." Robert took a deep breath and straightened his shoulders, as if physically taking on the weight of his responsibility. "I'm ready." In the courtyard, Ethan had moved to stand beside Thunder, one hand resting on the horse's shoulder. The setting sun cast long shadows across the flagstones, gilding both boy and horse in warm light that softened their outlines. It was a scene of perfect tranquility, until Ethan spotted his father in the doorway. The boy's body tensed visibly. Thunder, sensitive to the change, shifted position slightly, moving closer to Ethan's side. Miguel, noting the arrival, signed a quick "it's okay" to Ethan before stepping back to give the family space. Robert approached slowly, stopping several feet away. For a moment, father and son simply looked at each other across a distance that seemed both physical and immeasurable. Then Robert raised his hands and began to sign. His movements were careful, deliberate, clearly the result of intense study rather than casual learning. "I am proud of you," he signed. "Your art shows truth. I'm sorry I did not listen before. I'm learning now." Ethan watched his father's hands with an intensity that suggested he was memorizing every movement, every facial expression that accompanied the signs. Thunder remained alert beside him, a silent guardian ready to intervene if needed. After what seemed an eternity, Ethan's own hands rose to respond. "You are learning my language?" Robert nodded, relief visible in his face at his son's willingness to communicate. "Every day," he signed. "I want to know your words, your thoughts." Something shifted in Ethan's expression, not quite forgiveness, but a softening, an openness to possibility that hadn't been there before. He glanced at Thunder, then back at his father, his hands forming a question. "Can he come home too? When I do?" Robert hadn't expected this question, though in retrospect it seemed obvious. His gaze moved to the horse, taking in the animal's protective stance beside his son. The same horse he had once considered selling as unmanageable had shown more wisdom and compassion than he had. "Yes," he signed without hesitation. "Thunder has earned his place. Our home is his home now." Ethan's smile transformed his face, illuminating features that too often had been shadowed by wariness and hurt. He turned to Thunder, pressing his forehead briefly against the horse's muzzle in a gesture of shared joy. Inside the community center, the exhibition continued, with Superintendent Phillips now introducing a surprise addition to the program, a short film documenting the establishment of a new initiative at the Regional School. Named the Thunder Project, it would bring therapy animals into classrooms for deaf and hard-of-hearing students, based on research showing the profound benefits of animal-assisted learning for children with communication differences. As she explained the project, images flashed on a screen behind her, Ethan working with younger deaf children, showing them how to approach and connect with horses. Thunder standing patiently as tiny hands explored his coat. Miguel demonstrating basic care techniques to interested students. The footage had been shot over the past 3 weeks, during which Ethan had begun attending the regional school part-time. His transition was being carefully managed, with Eleanor providing a stable home base while Robert worked to make the ranch a safe and welcoming environment for his son's eventual return. In the courtyard, unaware of the presentation happening, inside, father and son continued their halting conversation. Each signed statement was considered carefully, weighted with the significance of new understanding being forged between them. Thunder watched the exchange with alert eyes, occasionally shifting position, but never moving far from Ethan's side. Twilight deepened around them. Robert reached slowly into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small box wrapped in simple blue paper. He held it out to Ethan, who accepted it with curious hands. "For you," Robert signed. "Open it." Ethan carefully unwrapped the package to reveal a wooden box with his name carved into the lid. Inside, nestled in velvet, lay a silver pocket watch, old-fashioned, with an engraved case and a chain that gleamed in the fading light. "It was my father's," Robert signed. "His father gave it to him when he turned 13. He hesitated, his hands faltering briefly before continuing. "Your birthday is next week. I wanted you to have it now." The significance of the gesture wasn't lost on Ethan. The watch represented not just a family heirloom, but recognition, acknowledgement that he stood in a line of Mitchell men, fully and equally his father's son, despite the differences between them. As Ethan examined the watch, his fingers tracing the intricate engravings, on its case, the courtyard door opened again. Eleanor emerged, followed by several visitors who had specifically requested to meet the boy behind the artwork and the horse who had inspired it. "Ethan," Eleanor signed, approaching the pair. "People want to meet both of you. Is that okay?" The boy looked to his father, a habitual checking for permission that would take time to fade. Robert nodded encouragingly. "I'll be right here," he signed. With that reassurance, Ethan tucked the watch carefully into his pocket and turned to greet the visitors, his posture straightening with newfound confidence. Thunder remained by his side as people approached, maintaining a protective closeness while allowing interaction. Eleanor moved to stand beside Robert, watching as Ethan demonstrated to a fascinated young girl how Thunder responded to hand signals. "He's extraordinary," she said softly. "Both of them are." Robert nodded, his eyes never leaving his son. "Sarah always said he had a special way about him. I didn't want to see it. Didn't want to see him as different." "Different isn't lesser," Eleanor replied. "It's just different. Sometimes it's more." As the evening progressed, the courtyard filled with visitors eager to meet Ethan and Thunder. The boy's initial shyness gave way to animated signing as he explained his artwork and his connection with the horse. Miguel stayed nearby, translating for those who didn't understand ASL, while Robert watched with growing pride, occasionally joining conversations when Ethan invited him to do so. Near the end of the event, as the crowd began to thin, Superintendent Phillips approached with a woman who introduced herself as a representative from a regional publishing house. She expressed interest in working with Ethan to develop his drawings into an illustrated book that could be shared with schools and libraries across the country. "A book?" Ethan signed, his eyes wide. "Your story matters," the woman replied through Miguel's translation. "It could help other children understand different ways of experiencing the world, and it might help adults remember how to listen better." The boy considered this seriously, then looked to Thunder as if consulting with the horse. After a moment, he nodded decisively. "Yes," he signed, "but Thunder is the hero. The book should have his name." The publisher smiled. "Of course. Thunder would make a perfect title." As plans were discussed for future meetings and project development, Robert found himself standing slightly apart, watching his son step confidently into a future that looked nothing like what he had envisioned. The rigid expectations he had held, the narrow path he had tried to force Ethan to follow, all of it seemed not just wrong now, but tragically limited. Eleanor joined him, noticing his pensive expression. "What are you thinking, Robert?" He was silent for a long moment before answering. "That I almost missed this, all of it, his talent, his courage, who he really is." "But you didn't miss it," Eleanor reminded him gently. "You're here now. That's what he'll remember." The event concluded with a brief ceremony in the main hall, where Ethan was presented with a certificate recognizing his contribution to the community and the deaf education program. Standing on the small stage with Thunder beside him, the boy seemed transformed from the frightened child tied to a post in a storm. His eyes were clear and direct, his signing confident as he thanked everyone who had supported him. When asked if he wanted to share any final thoughts with the audience, Ethan considered for a moment, then signed a simple message that Miguel translated for the room. "Sometimes when you can't speak with your voice, you find other ways to be heard, and sometimes the ones who hear you best aren't the ones you expect." Itashas. Gaze moved to Thunder, then to his father, who stood at the edge of the stage. There was understanding in that look, not complete healing, which would take much longer, but the beginning of something new and tentatively hopeful. As the crowd dispersed into the cool evening air, Robert approached his son. His hands moved, with growing confidence. "Ready to go home? To Eleanor's, I mean." Ethan nodded, then surprised his father by taking his hand, a small gesture of trust that meant more than any words could have expressed. Together, they walked Thunder to the trailer Miguel had prepared for transporting the horse back to Eleanor's house. The night sky above Clearwater was clear now, stars emerging in patterns that had guided generations before them. As Robert helped Ethan secure Thunder for the journey, he noticed his son looking upward, a peaceful expression on his face. "What do you see?" Robert signed, following the boy's gaze. Ethan's hands formed words that his father wouldn't have understood a month. "And to go, Mom used to say the stars are always talking to us. We just have to learn how to listen. Robert felt his throat tighten. Sarah had indeed said those words, though he had forgotten them until this moment. He nodded, unable to sign a response, as emotion overwhelmed him. In the silence between them, something important was exchanged. A shared memory, a point of connection that had been there all along, waiting to be recognized. Thunder nickered softly from the trailer, as if adding his own acknowledgement to the moment. Later that night, after Ethan had fallen asleep in Eleanor's guest room, Robert sat on the porch swing, contemplating the path ahead. The court had made it clear that Ethan's return to the ranch would be gradual and conditional, based on demonstrated changes in the home environment and Robert's continued progress in counseling and parenting classes. Yet, for the first time since Sarah's passing, Robert felt genuinely hopeful. The isolation he had imposed on himself and his son had been shattered, replaced by a community of support that he had forgotten existed. The journey would be challenging, but he was no longer walking it alone. Eleanor joined him on the porch, offering a mug of coffee that he accepted gratefully. "The publishers want him to start work on the book right away," she said, settling into a wicker chair nearby. "They think it could be ready by next spring." Robert nodded, turning the mug in his hands. "He'll do it well. He sees things others don't." "Like his mother," Eleanor agreed. Then after a pause, "And like you, when you choose to look." The simple truth of her statement hung in the night. Air between them, Robert had always prided himself on his keen eye for horseflesh, his ability to read weather patterns, his practical knowledge of the land. Yet he had been blind to what mattered most, the unique gifts of his own child. "I'm learning," he said finally, "to look, to listen, even when there's no sound." Eleanor smiled, hearing in his words an echo of the promise he had made to Ethan in the courtyard. That's all any of us can do, learn and grow day by day. From the small shed at the edge of Eleanor's property came the soft sounds of thunder settling for the night, a quiet nickering, the shuffle of hooves on fresh straw. The horse had adapted to his temporary home with remarkable ease, as if understanding that his presence there was part of a larger healing. In the morning, Ethan would wake to begin a new chapter in a story that had taken an unexpected turn. There would be school sessions with other deaf children, art lessons with a local teacher who had volunteered her time, and carefully supervised visits to the ranch where Robert was preparing a studio space in what had once been a storage room. Thunder would remain a constant in this evolving narrative, not just a protector now, but a bridge between past and future, between father and son, between different ways of experiencing the world. The horse, who had once been considered too wild to keep, had become an anchor, a silent witness to transformation. As Robert rose to leave, promising to return the next day for an afternoon visit with Ethan, he paused at the porch steps. "I keep thinking about what he said tonight, about the stars talking to us." Eleanor nodded, understanding the weight of those words. Sarah always had a way of seeing the poetry in things. "I lost that when I lost her," Robert admitted. "But I think Ethan never did. Even through everything, he kept that part of her alive." "Children often preserve what we most need to remember," Eleanor said softly, "if we have the wisdom to pay attention." Robert glanced toward the small bedroom window where his son slept, then at the shed where Thunder kept his silent vigil, two unlikely teachers showing him a way back to himself. "Good night, Eleanor," he said, descending the steps with a lighter tread than when he had arrived. "Thank you for helping me listen." As his truck pulled away, Eleanor remained on the porch, wrapped in the peaceful sounds of a small town settling into night. From inside the house came the soft ticking of the grandfather clock that had marked time in her family for generations. From the shed came Thunder's occasional movements, a reassuring presence in the darkness. And from above, the stars continued their ancient conversation, audible to those who had learned to listen with more than ears. In Ethan's room, The silver pocket watch rested on the bedside table, its hands moving steadily forward, marking not just hours and minutes, but the beginning of a new understanding between father and son, a silent conversation that, like Thunder's remarkable journey, would find its way home against all odds. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Ethan and Thunder touched your hearts. If you want to keep experiencing stories like this one, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share in the comments what moved you the most. Here, every story is a reminder that love can conquer even the deepest darkness.